Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, the risk metric. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, where of course you can get access to this risk metric as well as risk metrics for other cryptocurrencies as well. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, I released a video a few days ago discussing the risk metric for Bitcoin. And the purpose of that video, this risk metric for Bitcoin has been around since 2019. As far as I'm concerned, it has stood the test of time. It's done a remarkable job, not only of showing where the highs were, but also where the lows were. It has had some struggles in the sense of the second 2021 top was difficult, but the first one was fairly easy to identify. The risk metric went into the 0.9 to 1 risk band around 60K when most everyone else was screaming for 300K. The risk metric said, no, this is the top. And in late 2022, it did a good job of identifying and carving out those lows. But it's also done a good job, I think, of identifying similarities between this cycle and what happened over here in 2019. Now, as it relates to other cryptocurrencies, you have to be careful, especially with altcoins. Now, I kind of consider Ethereum to be somewhere in the middle. It's not in the same league as Bitcoin, but I also think that's a step above the altcoin market. So it's kind of somewhere in between. But let me give you an example before we get too far into, say, the risk metric for Ethereum and, of course, by association, a lot of different altcoins. Let me give you an example of why it makes sense to be careful with the altcoin market before you put, faith into the idea that they'll all eventually bottom out against Bitcoin. Okay. There are plenty of altcoins that just asymptotically go to zero against Bitcoin over a long enough time period. And if you ask a Bitcoin maxi, all cryptocurrencies do that. But there's some evidence that would suggest that's not always true for every cryptocurrency, although it has been true for the vast majority of them. Now, over a long enough period of time, maybe it is true for all cryptocurrencies. And the thing about Ethereum that is sort of the elephant in the room is that it's been putting in lower highs against Bitcoin since 2017, right? I mean, that's sort of the elephant in the room. That's the glass half empty approach. The glass half full approach would say, yeah, you know what? It has been putting in lower highs, but it's also been putting in higher lows. So maybe it's just converging to whatever the fair value is probably the more appropriate way to look at the ETH Bitcoin valuation. So when thinking about alt Bitcoin pairs and altcoin risk metrics, you have to be careful because sometimes you just don't have enough data to tell you what is an appropriate risk level. For instance, let's take an altcoin from a prior cycle. And I've talked about this one a few times before. Dash Bitcoin, right? Dash Bitcoin. Has there ever been a time when it made sense to look at this chart and think, oh, that was a good time to get in? Since 2017. Has there ever really been a great time? No, it's just been in a macro downtrend, right? It's been a macro downtrend. It turned into a relic, right? And so if you go look at like the Dash USD valuation, right? If you look at the Dash US, or sorry, this is the wrong one. If you look at the Dash USD valuation, and let's just go over to this one, you can see that, it did take part in some of the bull market from 2021, but it actually was a lower high if you compare it to, say, a prior cycle. I'm trying to figure out if we have one here that we can look at. Actually, I just saw one that'll work here. So you can see that it did take part in the 2021 bull market, but it was just a lower high compared to 2017. So you have to be careful with some of the altcoins because over a long enough time horizon, they just go to zero, not only on their USD pairs, but also asymptotically on their Bitcoin pairs as well. So if you were to try to develop a risk metric for something like this, what's it ever going to tell you, right? What's it ever going to tell you? I mean, it basically the price today for an altcoin like Dash is about as low as it's been since 2017. So thinking back to Ethereum, why then have I been so against putting too much thought into Ethereum over the last several years? In fact, in 2022, the risk level did go pretty low. And honestly, Had I known the chart was going to look like this, I probably would have picked some more up, right? I mean, I do have some Ethereum, but it's just ETH that I got way back over here. Everything that I've done, since late 2022, I mean, early 2022, I converted my altcoins to Bitcoin. Mid 2022, at around 0.07 to 0.08, I converted my ETH to Bitcoin. Late 2022, I bought Bitcoin with US dollars. But why have I been so against the idea of accumulating ETH after all these years, right? After all these years. And the reason is opportunity cost is the reason that it has been, right? It's opportunity cost. It's not about will it go up. It's always been about will it go up with respect to Bitcoin, right? That is the argument. Now, for me, I don't care if an altcoin goes up if it's bleeding back to Bitcoin. It's the same thing. Like, people give me a hard time about Litecoin all the time because, it does sometimes go up. But the problem is that, yes, it might occasionally go up, but it's still underperforming Bitcoin. And if you look at like the Litecoin Bitcoin valuation, you'll see that it just goes to zero against Bitcoin over a long enough time horizon. Doesn't mean it doesn't occasionally pump, right? But there hasn't really been a great entry into this in forever because it just keeps on bleeding. So when it comes to altcoins and risk metrics for altcoins, you have to be careful because there's no guarantee that it's not just asymptotically going to zero against the US dollar and against Bitcoin. So the reason why I have been so tuned out to everything going on over with Ethereum, it's not because it's not because I thought it couldn't go up, although I haven't really had a great view of it. It's just because I think and I have thought that it has been in the process of bleeding back to Bitcoin over all these years. And what's fascinating is, a lot of people talk about market cycles, and I chime in occasionally too. But the reality with the ETH Bitcoin valuation is this is all one cycle, is it not? The ETH Bitcoin drop, it never really stopped going down. Now it could be in the process of carving out a bottom in Q4 this year, but and maybe even now, right? I don't know. I mean, it's possible as early as September, as I've said. But the problem is that it never stopped going down. So while there's part of me that was like, no, it makes sense to get some ETH because, okay, it went down 77% or 80% or whatever. It can probably bounce. There was another part of me that thought, why, right? Opportunity cost. Every dollar you put in ETH is a dollar you're not putting into something else. And if Bitcoin's going to outperform it, then you have to be careful. Now, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin's going to always outperform it. This is the argument I've been in with people for a long time. And I know you're probably thinking, like, isn't this called the risk metric video? Like, what is he talking about? It all comes back to it, right? It all comes back to that idea of if the risk is where it is, does it make sense to get in or get out? And with Bitcoin, I stick to the risk metric. I just stick to the risk metric. But with altcoins, there's this second layer you have to peel back. And it's not about just, is the risk low? It's, what's it going to do against the king? That's what I want to know, right? Because Bitcoin's lower risk. And if you're buying ETH and it's going down against Bitcoin, you're taking on more risk, getting less reward. Now, could that regime start to change? I think it very well could, but not until 2025. Not until 2025. And so when I look at risk charts for altcoins in general, before I get even excited about them at all, what I have to do is I have to think to myself, are we in a Bitcoin dominance uptrend or Bitcoin dominance downtrend? And for the last 3 years, I've thought Bitcoin dominance uptrend. Therefore, I've dismissed Ethereum. And rightfully so, right? Rightfully so. Now, some people might feel some way about that, but the reality is that the loudest critics never would have guessed that ETH Bitcoin was going to go to 0.04, right? Ever. That was not on the menu. It never was. The reality is that, sitting at 0.042 was not something that was remotely possible in so many people's view. And yet here we are. So I contend, while it was not a popular view, it was the right view that ETH was going to bleed to Bitcoin, and being technically correct is the best way to be correct. Opportunity cost. It's the same thing, right? If you were to run a modern portfolio theory simulation of Bitcoin and ETH, it'll tell you your Sortino ratio is maximized at 80% Bitcoin, 20% ETH. But your volatility is minimized at 93% Bitcoin, 7% ETH. And this has been more where I am. My portfolio hasn't even been 7% ETH. I've been wanting to really minimize my risk and stick with the king and say, you know what, dominance is going to go higher. It doesn't mean Bitcoin can't go down. Bitcoin could drop, right? I've been on the side of that, especially since March when gold broke out and USDT dominance hit its trend line. I said, look, Bitcoin's probably going to drop for a while. 6 to 9 months, at least 6 to 9 months, and it's already been 6 months. So this is why it makes sense to consider not just the risk metric when it comes to altcoins, but also their Bitcoin valuations. So right now, the risk level on ETH is 0.517. It's still kind of high. It doesn't mean it can't go higher. And in fact, if you were to look, right, if you were to just go look at the last, we've made a lot of comparisons to 2016 and 2019, have we not? We have. And the reason for the 2016, 2019 comparison, as I've said, is look, ETH Bitcoin has broken down 3 times in its history. Once in 2016, once in 2019, and now again, once in 2024. So don't tell me not to compare this to 2019. Everyone who said that was wrong because Bitcoin was putting in lower highs for 6 months. Don't say that I can't do that because this looks very similar to either this or that. It actually kind of looks like a combination of this or that. And so perhaps this is a combination of 2016 and 2019, which is kind of what my base case is. So when I look at this chart, what do I see? I see that ETH Bitcoin is likely going to form a bottom between now and the end of the year. It's possible that it's already in, but I'd still say, I'm still sort of leaning that it could go sub 0.04. But there is one thing to consider. It doesn't have to immediately, but I will say this. If you were to look at ETH USD in 2016 and in 2019, it actually rallied in September. And in 2016, it topped out September 20th, I believe. It was the week of September 19th, but I think it actually topped out September 20th. And then in 2019, it had a September rally, and it topped out September 19th. So I'm not saying it can't go up. In fact, in 2016 and in 2019, ETH actually went up in September. In 2019, it got rejected off the bull market support band after bleeding in August. Could happen again, right? It could certainly happen again. But here's the point. Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed here. Right there. ETH USD did not. It still went down in Q4, just like it did in 2016. What does this have to do with the risk metric, right? Well, if you look at the risk metric and you remove everything, and remember the risk metric goes from 0 to 1, 0 is low risk, 1's high risk, and you isolate the 0.7 to 0.8 risk band. That's all we're looking at right now, 0.7 to 0.8. We hit it right here. Kind of looks similar to what happened in 2016, right? You see that? You see here, March and June. March and June. Same exact thing. In fact, you may be surprised to know, and you shouldn't be surprised because I've mentioned it probably about 1,000 times this year. Maybe not that many, but a lot. That every month that has been green in 2024 for ETH was also green in 2016. And every month that was red for ETH in 2024 was also red in 2016. You don't believe me? Look at this. June, July, and August were red. June, July, and August were red. April was also red, just like back over here. But guess what? Back then, January, February, March were green, just like over here. January, February, March were green. Every month has been the same, except for 2019 has been or 2024 has been a weaker version of 2016. Because at the end of 2016, August, this was just a wick. But at the end of this one, it wasn't, right? I mean, it actually closed down here, unlike 2016. It's a combination of the weakness from 2019 and the structure of 2016 with a top in March and another top in June. A little how do you do rally to draw people in, and then the final sell-off. Maybe that's what's going to happen again. But going back to the risk metric, you see this? You see how the risk levels look really similar to 2016? Now overlay 0.3 to 0.4 risk. We haven't gone there. We did in 2016, but we didn't go there until November. Even if it does rally to the bull market support band between now and then. And it's possible, right? I mean, I've said in 2019, we saw ETH go up into the bull market support band in September. Even in the month the Fed cut rates, we saw ETH rally into it, I believe. If you go back and look at 2019, the Fed cut rates right around here, and you can see that it got a little bit of a rally. I mean, it wasn't much, but it was something. It was something to say, hey, look at that, you know? But we haven't seen that 0.3 to 0.4 risk level yet, have we? We even saw it in 2019, right? You see this into 2019. Remember, we made the comparison to 2016. We made the comparison to 2019. In both cases, ETH went to the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band by the end of the year. By November, December, ETH risk was 0.03 to 0.04. Or sorry, 0.3 to 0.4. I'm thinking of the ETH Bitcoin ratio, which is probably also going to happen, 0.03 to 0.04. So ETH Bitcoin 0.03 to 0.04, ETH risk 0.3 to 0.4 by Q4. Does that make sense? Like, could it make sense? Could that actually happen? I think so. I think it could. And the reason why is because, well, it happened in 2016, it happened in 2019. I don't know why this time's going to be different. In 2019, it was the mid-cycle top. 2016, arguably the same thing. ETH Bitcoin broke down. Both the last two times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, 2016 and 2019, ETH dropped 70%. I know it sounds crazy, but guess what? It already dropped 50%. More than 50%, really. It already dropped 53%. And when it broke down here before the pandemic, it was like 68%. And in 2016, it was 70%. So two 70% drops after ETH Bitcoin broke down. And ETH Bitcoin broke down in 2024. But 70% down would actually get you closer to 1,200. I don't know if it's going to happen, but it could. It could. And what's fascinating about that 1,200 number is that it's right at the fair value logarithmic regression trend line. And the 0.3 to 0.4 risk level, which is where ETH went in Q4 of 2016 and Q4 of 2019, the 0.4 risk level, 0.3 to 0.4, 0.3 risk is $1,200. So there is a chance that that is the path. I could be wrong. I could be. I'm surprised ETH hasn't made that move already, right? I am. And I can't hide from that. I'm perplexed that it's taken this long, especially when it didn't take Bitcoin that long. I mean, you know, Bitcoin went to its lower logarithmic regression band what feels like decades ago. I mean, it was a couple of years, right? But I mean, it went there so long ago. and the rest is history. And then it went on to put in new all-time highs. What if the reason ETH can't yet put in new all-time highs is because it never went to its logarithmic regression band, which Bitcoin already did? And what if the reason it hasn't gone to new all-time highs is because ETH Bitcoin hadn't gone through that bottoming structure? Remember, in the last cycle, when ETH went on this rally to new all-time highs, it was after ETH Bitcoin broke down and after ETH USD dropped 70%. It was after all that. We haven't had that yet, right? We have not had that yet. We've had part of it, right? I mean, ETH Bitcoin broken down. Check. ETH USD, 70% drop. 50 something. It's close, but still not quite there. Could ETH do something like this where it gets a little bit of a bounce? I mean, it could be a 2019 style bounce where it's barely anything and not worth talking about. Or could it be like 2016 where it's a little bit more interesting? But the point is, could ETH do something like this where it, goes up a little bit into the bull market support band at some point, gets rejected, comes down here by the end of the year, and then bounces out of that into 2025? Is that a likely scenario? I mean, it seems reasonable to me. And what's fascinating about it is if it does that, it will look almost identical to what happened last cycle. And the cycle before that. When ETH sets these lows, right, it usually, not always, right, not always, but it usually likes to test them. Now, in 2016, it was able to hold the low from earlier in the year, and that was it. But this cycle, you can see that it has not been able to do that, right? And it's been spending more and more time below it. So then the next argument is, well, maybe it has to go back down and test some of these prior lows, right? Ones at like 1,500, and then ones at around 1,200 or so. But I do wonder if that's the ultimate outcome here. Because if it plays out like that, and you watch ETH go to the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band by the end of the year, well, then it's not different, right? It played out how it played out in the last two cycles. Now, what could possibly cause this to happen? What could it be? Because, I've heard every excuse under the sun as to why it won't happen. Merge, deflationary, community, etc., etc., etc. But guess what? While that stuff could theoretically be important, what's more important and what trumps all of it is monetary policy. And that's the reason why none of the proof of stake, right? That's the reason why it hasn't been able to go up as much as people thought it would, because of monetary policy. And you can pretty clearly see, and if you add on here 0.6, 0.7, right, you can pretty clearly see that ETH will sometimes do this. It'll get a little ahead of itself in the cycle and then cool back off to the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band by Q4 of the same year that ETH Bitcoin breaks down. And this is the year in this cycle where ETH Bitcoin breaks down. It's in 2024. It's not in 2023. It's in 2024. Therefore, maybe this is the year where ETH USD goes to the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band by the end of the year, and where ETH USD finally goes home after all this time. It is a possibility. Now, if you were to look at the highest risk bands, 0.8 to 1, we haven't gone there this cycle. Not yet. And maybe we will next year. I don't think it's going to happen this year. I really don't. Normally, the altcoin market, respects Bitcoin valuations, right? If the Bitcoin valuation is breaking down, the USD valuation eventually follows, is kind of how it works. And it's kind of like what we've talked about with the jaws of liquidity. But instead of the jaws of liquidity, instead of thinking about, and if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, I get, how did I get on this? But when we talk about the jaws of liquidity, it's what I use to sort of track alt Bitcoin pairs. And the jaws of liquidity essentially are looking at net liquidity and saying, all right, well, alt Bitcoin pairs follow net liquidity pretty well. right? If net liquidity is going down, all Bitcoin pairs are going down. Net liquidity is going up, all Bitcoin pairs are going up. But the jaws of liquidity are when you see divergence between these metrics, right? If you were to look at, say, ETH/USD and liquidity, these are the jaws of liquidity that open. Same thing happened last cycle, right? The jaws of liquidity opened, and then eventually they snap shut, right? Eventually they snap shut. But here's the thing. I wonder if the jaws of liquidity for Ethereum specifically, instead of looking at the Fed's balance sheet and all that good stuff, what if we say, what if the jaws of liquidity for ETH are the ETH Bitcoin pair? Nothing more, nothing less. Overlay ETH Bitcoin. And what you will see are the jaws of liquidity. The same idea. It's the same thing where the jaws of liquidity opened. You see that? Once you see it, you can't not see it. That's what I said back then. It's not that ETH can't go up. It's just that if it goes up, it's only because Bitcoin went up. Therefore, if you're going to put money into anything in crypto for the last 3 years, Bitcoin was a safer and better play than Ethereum. Because the only way ETH is going anywhere is if Bitcoin goes there first. Until at least looser monetary policy arrives. People keep telling me ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market. Show me on the screen. This bluish purple line is the ETH Bitcoin valuation rate. Show me on the screen where ETH has outperformed Bitcoin in the last 3 years. Right? It hasn't. But the reason is not because those people were wrong, per se. It's because there's two types of bull markets. There's bull markets where ETH Bitcoin goes up, and there's bull markets where ETH Bitcoin goes down. We saw the same thing last cycle. 2019 was a bull market for ETH/USD, but ETH Bitcoin was going down. 2024 has been the exact same thing. It's just been a larger version of it. And it makes sense for it to be a larger version of it, because if you were to overlay interest rates, this cycle, right, in terms of monetary policy, like rates, and it's been bigger than the last one. And that's why this process has gone on far longer than most people thought it possibly could. It's why Bitcoin dominance is taking so freaking long to go to 60%, because people don't believe in it, right? They thought that alts lead the bull market, but that's not true. Bitcoin leads the bull market. Bitcoin goes up and up and up until it can't go up anymore because the Fed's gone too far with monetary policy, and then the giants fall. And then the king bends the knee. And when the king bends the knee, when Bitcoin bends the knee, that's when the Fed pivots. And out of the pivot, out of the last rate cut, and out of quantitative easing, then Ethereum leads the bull market, but not before then. That's the mistake I think a lot of people make. They think that alts lead the bull, but Bitcoin leads the bull. The alts lead it after the pivot, not before. And that doesn't mean the first rate cut necessarily. Last cycle, it wasn't the first rate cut. It was after several rate cuts that ETH led the bull market. I think that people have gotten ahead of themselves because the Bitcoin QT bull market lasted longer than a lot of people thought it would. And they thought that it would hand off the reins to Ethereum, that ETH Bitcoin would bottom out sooner rather than later. In reality, ETH Bitcoin never stopped going down. I do think it's probably about to sort of enter into this bottoming process where it will form a low between now and the end of the year. But you have to wonder sometimes, when are the jaws going to snap shut, right? When are they going to snap shut? My guess is that they're going to snap shut and ETH will finally go back to the fair value logger in the correction trend line. And I think it's probably going to happen in the fourth quarter of this year. It's possible we go down there sooner, but if this cycle follows 2016 September or 2019 September at all, then it might not actually occur until October, November, December, right? So when I talk about the risk metric for Ethereum, it would be easy to criticize me and say, why weren't you getting ETH over here, right? My argument is because I bought Bitcoin instead. And I said that on ITC Premium, which is where you can get access to these charts. But I said that on ITC Premium. I published the buys for Bitcoin. And I said, look, guys, it's not that ETH can't go up. In fact, if Bitcoin goes up, ETH will probably go up. It's that ETH will likely bleed to Bitcoin. So imagine if in July of 2022, you bought ETH. You're doing okay, right? You're not hurting per se right now. I mean, if you bought ETH at $1,000 to 2,500, who cares, right? But once you've been in crypto for a few cycles, you care less about USD valuations and you care more about Bitcoin valuations. And so when I think about buying ETH, and had I done it in sort of late 2022 when I was buying Bitcoin, that means I would have been buying ETH at 0.07, 0.08. And today it's at 0.04. So yes, technically it's done well, but opportunity cost matters. Because if you look at plenty of other altcoin charts, as I showed earlier, Litecoin, Bitcoin, Dash Bitcoin, right? There's thousands of them that follow that. There was never a time where it made sense to swap for Bitcoin. There are some that do well, right? And Ethereum, by being number 2, probably has the highest chance of bottoming out before the end of the year. But when I think about the altcoin market, I have to go a little beyond the risk metrics. I look to them for confluence if Bitcoin dominance is not in a macro uptrend. If Bitcoin dominance is in a macro uptrend, I generally just stick with Bitcoin. But I do think that Bitcoin dominance will likely top out before the end of the year. Doesn't mean it can't wick higher next year, but I generally think that the top's going to be set before the end of the year. And then next year, I think ETH Bitcoin will go up. But there's still 4 more months to go this year. So let's see if this is how the cycle plays out in the same way it did in 2016 and 2019, where it goes down, it gets a little bit of a reprieve in September, and then continues its descent into Q4. We see ETH go back to the 0.3 to 0.4 wristband. It goes home, and then on the other side of looser monetary policy, it starts to finally outperform Bitcoin. And the people that said it was going to do so 3 years ago because of the merge and because of the deflationary tokenomics and because of the ETFs, they're all gone. Because they believed in that stuff way before it was time to. Because they dismissed monetary policy and they thought that ETH Bitcoin could never go to 0.04. And here it is, likely going to bottom out, my guess, over the next few months if it hasn't already. Again, my base case, to be clear, my base case is that it could very well go sub 0.04, especially in Q4, especially November, December timeframe. It could very well go sub 0.04. If it has not gone below 0.04 by January 1st, 2025, my guess is that it's not going to this cycle. So I just want to be clear about my views. If it's not below 0.04 by the last day of this year, then it's probably not going to. For now, I still lean towards likely going to see a 0.03 print at some point before the year is over. Might not be September. I mean, it's not even that far away. I mean, it could be September. Right? It's very possible. And in fact, if it follows 2019, it'll wick down there within the next week or two. Okay? And if it does that and then bounces like it did in 2019, then we might just watch it sort of like, come down here. We might watch it sort of bleed, bounce, and then double bottom in December. Like, that's also a possibility, kind of like 2019. So be on the lookout for that. I would say this. If ETH Bitcoin goes sub 0.04 within the next week or two, that could be the bottom. It could be. But we would still have to test that low in December, more than likely, especially if ETH USD follows this trend of going to 0.3 to 0.4 risk in December of the year that ETH Bitcoin breaks down. those are my views on Ethereum. Hopefully they are crystal clear. I've been clear on my views for a long time. I have been wrong at times, admittedly, but I think the views on ETH Bitcoin have been mostly correct. ETH USD has skirted going home for many years now, and we will see how much longer it can avoid what I feel like is the eventual fate. And every time you see these trend lines, whenever they break, whenever these trend lines have historically broken, that's when ETH goes home, right? And there is potentially Q4, and it would line up with the risk metric, 0.3 to 0.4 risk. By the way, if you take the color coding out of it and you look at it like this, that's what it looks like. It looks really similar to 2019, right? Just a little bit higher of a peak because the interest rates went higher and it was higher for longer, right? I mean, I said 5.5% a long time ago. It was higher for longer. You can see the risk level on ETH went a little bit higher than it did in 2019, but it looks like we're on the other side of that now, and it's just been coming down just like 2019. And then I think we'll probably figure out, between 0.3 to 0.4 risk right here, see late 2019, and then also look at late. Oh, sorry, this is Bitcoin risk, but it's same general idea, right? This is ETH risk right here. It looks similar to 2019, right? But if you look at late 2019, you can see it went to 0.3 to 0.4 risk. 2016, 0.3 to 0.4 risk. Same idea. That's your soft landing, is 0.3 to 0.4 risk. That's the soft landing. We'll talk about, hard landing later if the soft landing targets actually pan out, right? I mean, if ETH doesn't go home in Q4, what's the point of talking about a hard landing? If especially if it's wrong. So if 0.3 to 0.4 happens, like it did in 2016 and 2019 when ETH Bitcoin broke down, then it makes sense to talk about a hard landing. You can see what a hard landing looked like last cycle, right? I mean, it actually went a bit lower than that, right? It ended up on here it only went to 0.33 risk, but I think it even wicked a little bit below that. If you look at like the hourly candles during the during the actual capitulation. So those are my views on Ethereum. That's the risk metric. If you guys like the content, again, you can subscribe to the channel. We have the Into the Cryptoverse website, thousands of charts, not just for Ethereum, also for Bitcoin. We even have one for the altcoin market cap, total market cap, and a lot of different altcoins that you can follow. Remember, be careful. You don't want to put your faith in a bleeder. Sometimes risk levels can be low based on historical data, but they can stay low if they follow something like Litecoin or Dash. So you want to make sure that whatever you're getting into is not a bleeder, because if it's a bleeder, then you wake up you wake up 5 years from now, and before you know it, your altcoin's down 99.9% against Bitcoin, and you've been throwing your money into a relic that's never going to go back to all-time highs. So make sure what you're getting is not a bleeder, and the way to do that is to look and see what it's doing on its Bitcoin pair. I'll see you guys next time. And next time, we'll probably talk a little bit more about the outline for Q4. If things play out. The thing right now I'm not sure about, I'm not really sure, is ETH Bitcoin going to capitulate this week like it did in 2019? Or is it going to wait until December to capitulate? So my guess is if we go sub 0.04 this week, we'll probably bounce out of it and then retest it in December. If we do not go sub 0.04 this week, then we'll likely see it happen in December. Those are my views. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, video, thumbs up. See you guys next time. Bye.